Mark Rogers TV on what in its first year seems to have already taken hold as the National Signing Day. We bring in Steve Hellwagon from Bucknuts on 247 Sports to help us break down the Ohio State class. Steve, we appreciate you jumping on board. Now you've got a ton of stuff that you're working on these days with bowl preparations and also this recruiting class with 2 5-stars, 16 4-stars. I don't think there would have been any question that this was decidedly the best class in college football entering yesterday, but there were a few late misses that would be the only negative that you could possibly come up with regarding 2018.
Yeah, I agree. I think this was a class that they worked really hard to build this, and some things unraveled for them, I guess, at Ohio State down the stretch. And they lose a couple of national top 100 prospects who'd been committed to this class. You're talking about the Georgia quarterback Emory Jones. You're also talking about a defensive back out of California, Jaden Woodbay. They ended up going to other colleges. Woodbay, I think most people thought he would go to USC, and instead he ended up going to Florida State. Emory Jones, instead of ending up at Ohio State, he ended up going to Florida with the new coach there, Dan Mullen. And so, what you thought was going to be the number 1 ranked class in the country, as it turns out, it's still a very good class. In some of the rankings, Ohio State fell behind Georgia, which had such a great late push, it seems, to bring in some top talent. So I think that, at this stage, and again, it's an ongoing situation because there will be more players signing with schools the next today, and then of course tomorrow, and then this period will end, and then you'll go into the regular or the normal National Signing Day on February the 7th. And Steve Wiltfong from 247 Sports put out some statistics that said that 65% of the guys the total from last year, that's about how many guys signed yesterday as part of the early period. So there is 1/3 of the drama still out there, I guess, to come. But in Ohio State's instance, they signed 21 guys. They're pretty much full up, and they're just hoping to add probably a couple defensive ends here in the last go-round. I know Tyreek Smith is a national top 100 prospect from Cleveland Heights, and he'd be a great addition to this class as things go forward.
Steve, you mentioned the 65% that have signed in FBS football, but you mentioned Ohio State just about full. Most of the guys that I bring on, like yourself, they cover the major programs. They have pretty much the same line that the class is full, that they went out in that early period and tried to gather them up. So I think that even though that 65% is the number across the board, it seems like the elite programs and even going through, the top 20 to 25 programs, that they've really taken hold of this early signing period. And obviously they have more so the pick of the litter. So the percentages are even higher for the Blue Bloods.
Yeah. Our response when you talk to people at Ohio State was they considered this to be the signing day. So they put most or all of their eggs in this basket, and I think this will be the new normal if they keep this. And what we were encountering or what we were hearing was prospects were being pressured across the board. Didn't matter if it was Big Ten or Mid-American Conference schools or whoever it was, to make a decision, because college coaches did not want to go past yesterday and still have a need that had not been fulfilled, because there was no way to predict or indicate who or what may still be out there kind of in the, I'll call it the secondary market, the guys that will sign in February. Now, I brought up Tyreek Smith a moment ago from Cleveland Heights, and he wants to announce his commitment, as a lot of kids have over the years, at one of the 2 big all-star games. So the one on the 4th, the one on the 6th. I want to say Under Armour is on the 4th in Orlando, and the U.S. Army is on the 6th in San Antonio. One of them on ESPN, the other one on NBC. So those are great showcases for the nation's top prospects. And every year, 8 or 10 kids on each broadcast announce their commitment publicly at that time. And I think that's something Tyreek Smith wanted to do. So he did not sign, or at least it hasn't been acknowledged publicly that he has signed with anybody. I think it's Ohio State, Penn State, not sure who else is involved. But that's an example of a kid who made the conscious decision that, hey, I'm going to announce in about 2 weeks, but it's going to be on my terms during the course of that broadcast. I'm sure there's some other kids as well who are doing that as well. But I think Ohio State is definitely the team to beat on Tyreek Smith, and he would help cushion the blow in some regard for Ohio State. They lost a defensive end commitment, Brenton Cox, who ended up signing, believe it or not, with Georgia. So he helps the class at Georgia become the #1 class, and he had been in the Ohio State class. So they had 3 huge decommitments that were all national top 100 players, although Cox was a little earlier in the process. But I guess that gives you an idea, an example of a kid who wanted to wait and will sign with this college in February.
Steve Hellwagen joining us from Bucknuts 247 Sports, the very best when it comes to college football recruiting in regards to looking at the measurements, and that's the go-to place. There's no question about that. If you follow high school football recruiting, as these guys sign now in late December, most of them as opposed to sometime in February. So in listening to a number of coaches' news conferences yesterday, Dabo Swinney, as is his MO, he's typically excited about everything, so he has no issue with this. Nick Saban's on the other end of the spectrum. He hates it. Urban Meyer basically says, hey, this is what we're presented. We have to do business. These are the positives. These are the negatives. I think the only positive he could come up with is, hey, we get these guys in the door, and we know that when we continue bowl practice after December 20th, 21st, that, hey, we've got our guys, and that relieves the workload later. But as soon as the Big Ten championship game was over, guys were on the road the next morning, hitting the trail, getting this done. But bringing up Dabo Swinney, much was made of the Jackson Carman flip, the top prospect from Cleveland. Just what was your take on this? It seems rather ridiculous that Dabo Swinney would make any kind of comments. I know that comments are made constantly, and who knows what is said, but about Urban Meyer's being 5 years older than Dabo Swinney, that he's on the back end of his career.
Yeah, that was a very interesting story that came out of Jackson Carman's press conference in Fairfield, Ohio, which it's down in the Cincinnati area. And he is originally from Dayton, and then he went to high school, I guess, in Fairfield, which is a suburb just on the north side of Cincinnati. But that came up that people asked him, well, did Clemson say anything about Ohio State? He said, as a matter of fact, they put out there that they weren't sure how much longer Urban Meyer was going to be the head coach at Ohio State. So that came out after Coach Meyer was done with his press conference. He did his in the morning around 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock with just the available names that they had at that point. And so Carman announced his commitment at 1 or 1:30, whatever time it was later in the day. And then that story came out probably around 2 p.m. when people were starting to circulate what they'd heard from him down there. And it was an instant bombshell that I think hit Twitter and the internet and everything else. And, say what you will, college coaches, if you ask them directly, will say, well, no, we never negative recruit. We don't have to. We have all of this. Why would we ever negative recruit somebody? But believe me, it's been going on since the first kid signed the first letter of intent 1,000 years ago. And I think it'll continue until the end of time. I think, people used the situation at Penn State against them, and that caused James Franklin and Bill O'Brien, whoever, over the last several years to bristle about that, and that they'd come back and say, well, that's all in our past. That has nothing to do with the future of our program. So, people are going to use whatever they can. All is fair in love and war and recruiting. I have learned that. I've been covering this since about 1989, almost 3 decades. And it is a spectator sport. That is the first thing, that even though you don't pay a ticket, or buy a ticket to come and watch and sit in a seat and watch it, but people now are watching it unfold. Last night, Jaden Woodbay had his press conference streamed live. It was supposed to start at 8:30 Eastern time, didn't start until 9. And the way I understand it, I'd been clued in he wasn't coming to Ohio State. So I sat there and watched North Carolina and Duke basketball last night instead of worrying about that. It wasn't until 10:30 p.m. when he announced where he was going. And of course, it wasn't Ohio State. He was going on to Florida State, where he had just visited. I mean, people were stunned that it wasn't USC, his hometown school, and it wasn't Ohio State, where he had been committed for the longest time. It was Florida State with a brand new head coach and a brand new staff, and just seems, man, out of nowhere. But he had that kind of connection, I guess, at the 11th hour, and that's where he ended up. But, as I say, it's become a spectator sport with people on these internet message boards and watching the live streams and just participating, tweeting, a week ago, Jackson Carman, in the eyes of many Ohio State fans. Today, he's a bullet that they dodged, because he's got baggage and, all this other stuff. These people are God bless them. I mean, they support sites like ours, but there is some original thought put into all of this, I'm sure, when people are reacting to what 17 and 18-year-old kids are doing and making, for them, the choice of a lifetime. This is the single biggest decision these kids have ever made up until this point, and really kind of shapes maybe, the next 4, 10, 30, 50 years of their lives. Is a very important decision.
Steve Hellwagon joining us from 247 Sports, Bucknuts, talking Ohio State recruiting with the Buckeyes bringing in quite a haul, number 2 nation in the nation by most services, including 247. Steve, I got to get your take on this because my level of interaction with this is from afar. It's through guys like you now. The closest I got to it was about 7 years in the SEC as a sports director at a TV station down there, and dealing with it just a couple days prior to, in the National Signing Day, we would do our big shows and run through the lists and talk to the head coaches and talk to the players and that sort of thing. Then we were done with it for another 12 months, especially we're talking late 90s, early 2000s. But for you, as soon as you spit out 1989, I've got to ask, what is the difference between covering this stuff in 1989 versus 2017?
Well, that is a great question. Obviously, the internet really didn't take hold. I mean, I wasn't an active participant on the internet until probably the end of 93 or 94. And at that moment is kind of when, up until that point, people subscribed to the weekly newspapers like Buckeye Sports Bulletin, the one that I worked on. You had Blue and White at Penn State with Phil Gross. That was an outstanding publication. Blue and Gold at Notre Dame. All the different schools had a weekly newspaper. And that's how these people got their recruiting news. Or with Tom Lemming and our guy Bill Kurlick and some of the others, you would call into a 900 number nationally to get the scoop and get the latest information on the visits, the offers, the commitments, and all that. Well, very slowly over time, all that information started to be shared on the internet. Some of it for free, quite a bit of it behind a paywall, obviously. And I think that is kind of when the game changed. I think what has happened, Mark, when I think about this, is you go back to the late 80s, and I'll just throw a name out there. John Cooper could tell Robert Smith, or any number of other guys. Orlando Pace was a name that we brought up. He could be recruiting the best players who everyone, Tom Lemming, was kind of the expert. He would tell everybody who the top 100 guys in the country were. That's all you knew. There wasn't rampant video. There was no internet to view video. You had to trade videotapes with coaches and these kind of things and get game tapes and sit there and actually plug it into your VCR and watch a kid to figure out whether he was any good or not. College coaches had to go out on the road, go into the high school, and in some cases dub off the video themselves because the high school coach is off teaching a class. I mean, and now the connectivity. What I'm getting back to is the college coach could go in to that situation and tell a kid the sky is purple. and the kid has no way of verifying it, no way of knowing it. He could lie to him about the depth chart. He could say, yeah, we only got one guy at your position when they have three. I mean, all of the cards, the coaches held all the cards in that day. There was no information out there for kids. I mean, you'd come on a visit to the school, and if they were paying attention, they'd get the information that they need to know to make the decision. But the advantage was entirely in the coach's hands. That is changed 150%. The kids now know every guy on the roster, every guy on the depth chart, because it's all right there on the internet. They watch every game the team plays. Used to be you'd only get 3 or 4 games a year. Now every game the team plays is on national television in these Power 5 conferences. So they can get your body of work. They know exactly your demeanor on the sideline. They know what everybody on ESPN says about you. They know what people say about you on Twitter. They know what's being said on the message boards. The advantage has flipped in many ways. Is there more information out there for college coaches? Yes. Is every play the kid had of his high school, junior, and senior year on the internet, on Huddle? Yes. But the kids have the ability, if they take advantage of it, to make a much more informed decision nowadays than they ever did before, just because of the connectivity. I mean, they're talking to one another on Twitter. They set up their own text groups to talk to one another about, oh, did you see Coach such and such said this to me? Well, he said this to me. Well, that doesn't add up. We need to find out what's going on. They're talking to one another and sharing information among themselves to the detriment of the college. So, yeah, I think that the internet has changed things so dramatically. The coverage is instantaneous. I mean, last night with Carmen in particular, midday, about an hour and a half before he announced, word got out he was going to Clemson. And people maybe didn't write a story to that effect, but it was rumored all over Twitter. The cat was out of the bag. He was going to Clemson. Everybody knew it. And for whatever reason, that gets out. He told somebody who told somebody, and it got out. Maybe he picked up the phone and called USC or called Ohio State and said, nah, I'm going to go to Clemson. And their operatives, I mean, you think about what's going on at Ohio State. They have Urban Meyer, they have the position coaches, then they have a guy named Mark Pantoni who's the recruiting coordinator, and now he's got 4 or 5 people who are not full-time assistant coaches who work just for him. They're breaking down tape. They're putting together letters and mailers, social media. They're designing neat graphics for these kids so that their coaches can tweet out, you know, this neat graphic about this kid and everything else. Somewhere in that machinery, when the word comes back that the kid is spurning Ohio State, and I'm just throwing this out there, I'm not saying that they're the ones who dropped it, but somebody somewhere got word that he was going to Clemson, and 90 minutes before the kid's press conference, every expert from every school now knows he's not going to Ohio State. He's not going to USC. He's going to Clemson, and that's exactly how it turned out. So in a nutshell, I mean, the information, it is instantaneous, where in the old days you had to wait for that weekly newspaper, or in some cases down south, the Atlanta Journal has always covered recruiting, even back to the 70s and 80s on a daily basis. But you would get a report sporadically in your local paper. You would have to wait for that fan newspaper to come once a week. Did we get so-and-so? Oh, we did. Great. You know, that's the only way you knew about it.
Fascinating stuff. Yeah, it was just a completely different world. A lot of people listening to us can't relate to it. Before I let you go, Steve, Matthew Baldwin was discussed by Urban Meyer, a quarterback out of Austin, Texas, rated in the top 20 nationally, and his tangibles and intangibles. Urban Meyer told a story about Ryan Day forcing Urban Meyer, when he was thinking Penn State at like 11 o'clock night before the game, to watch Matthew Baldwin on tape. We don't have to stick to Baldwin, just anybody who pops out of this class. And I know it's impossible with all the 4 and 5 stars included, but just based on what you've read, what you've seen, who are you excited to see playing on the field?
Well, I think Baldwin in some ways cushions the blow of them losing Emory Jones. I mean, they're two different kinds of players. I think Jones is more of a run pass guy who probably is almost a perfect fit for what they do with the zone read. But at the same time, Baldwin has had a tremendous senior year. And he comes from a high school, Lake Travis, I believe, there in Austin, that has produced a number of great quarterbacks. Patrick Murphy, who works on our staff, got online as this was all unfolding, and he read the list. It was like Reesing, who played at Kansas, Baker Mayfield, I believe, at Oklahoma, and 3 or 4 other guys who you have heard of and are household names. I mean, guys who went on to great college careers, played their high school football in this program. I can't attest to whether it's the same coaching staff or, but they're all drinking the same water there in that same football program. And this kid really didn't play much last year. I'm not sure who they had last year as their starting quarterback. I assume he's a freshman somewhere at a college. And so this kid gets the opportunity to step in there. He's throwing 70% of his passes. He's completing them. He has less than 10 interceptions. He's thrown for 40 touchdowns. And his team is playing for one of the big school state championships there in Texas this coming weekend. So as Coach Myers said, and I'm going to post this video on our website, he went through a checklist of 7 or 8 things that you need from a quarterback, and he said this kid hit every box. So that's a good thing. And the other thing about this is they're not going to push him into production right away because they've got Dwayne Haskins, they've got Joe Burrow, at least for now, and they've got Tate Martell, the outstanding quarterback from Las Vegas last year. So they got 3 guys who will be, quote, veterans coming back, and Baldwin can get into the system and learn and grow. But very intriguing prospect. Let's just leave it at that. I have no idea. I'm eager to see how he plays in the state championship. It'll be televised on Fox Southwest, and I've got the Fox College Sports package, so I can zone right in on that Saturday afternoon and see what he does. But the 3 names that they came out of this that I think will people remember: Teron Vincent, outstanding defensive tackle at IMG Academy down in Bradenton. He's originally from Baltimore, which has been a stronghold for Larry Johnson, the assistant coach for Ohio State, and the Buckeyes to recruit guys out of Baltimore. They've done pretty good there. So he's one, Teron Vincent. Plus, he's a big-time defensive tackle that they haven't really had. Jeremy Ruckert from Long Island, New York, is one of, if not the top tight end prospects in the country, a national top 50 guy. And you can compare any tight end you want to Gronkowski, but I watched that Steelers-Patriots Classic game the other day, and the Patriots are moving it down the field. Poor number 25 for the Steelers was always a step late and a step behind because the tight end creates such a mismatch. And again, you can't put Ruckert on that plane, but as a college guy, maybe he'll be able to create some type of similar mismatch situation. They're excited about that. And then one guy from here in Ohio, Jalen Gill, outstanding all-purpose back, running back, wide receiver, could fill the Percy Harvin role or the what they like to now call the Curtis Samuel role, I guess, in that Ohio State offense, as a guy who's a running back, he's a wide receiver, he does a little bit of everything. Those 3 guys are probably the top 3 signees right now for Ohio State in this class. And, yeah, they swung and missed on Carmen. They didn't get Emory Jones, and Jaden Woodbay kind of turned them away at the last minute. But there's still plenty of top prospects in this class.
And Urban Meyer called Ruckert the best tight end prospect he'd ever recruited. And even though Ohio State tight ends don't usually put up the kind of numbers that other tight ends in other systems do, we know what the end result has been, them mostly moving on to the NFL and becoming very productive players at the next level
Jeff
as well.
Hireman, as an example, Nick Van Nett and Jeff Hireman are both in the NFL, and I think Marcus Ball, the current tight end, will get some looks. He's had kind of an uneven college career with injuries and different things that have kind of held him back. But this season, when games were on the line, they went to Marcus Ball, and he came back winning touchdown against Penn State. He made some big plays for him. So now they're looking for the next guy in that line to come in.
Very good. Steve Hellwagon from Bucknuts on 247 Sports. I don't think we need to tell anyone. The cat's out of the bag. The 247 Sports is the place to go for high school football recruiting across the board. Bucknuts for Ohio State football fans. Steve, we appreciate you stopping by. Know you've got a ton going on, but always enjoy the discussion.
All right, Mark. Take care.